Dr. Shoemaker, thank you very much for being on the show. You contributed a tremendous amount of very common sense, practical, actual instruction to the occult community. And by the way, I have to thank you personally because I think about 10 or 15 years ago, you posted a video on how to do pranayama about
Right.
this bit, and that like showed me how to do it properly, and that's good shit, man. Like I spent a couple of years doing that, getting high, like that's so, and the fact that like that video helped me finally unlock that bit of library, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Excellent. I'm
Yeah.
glad that was helpful. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And thank you for having me on the show. I'm
Absolutely.
happy to be here.
Absolutely. So let's just kick it off. I mean, talk about why don't you tell the audience a little bit about who you are, the Thelemic background you're coming from, and your new book.
Sure. So, for those who may not know, I am a clinical psychologist. I've been practicing since the mid '90s when I got out of school, and right also around that same time, I started my path in Thelema. So it's been about 31 years now of one thing or another. Joined up with AA and the larger tradition that I work with now in my order, the order I administer, called Temple of the Silver Star, and also with O.T.O. right all around that same time. So since then, I've been doing a lot of kind of administration of groups and supervising students, and that's been a huge part of my non-professional life for the past 30 years. Right now, I'm the Prolocutor and Chancellor of the Temple of the Silver Star, which is a Thelemic Golden Dawn patterned order, and I work regularly with administering AA, and of course, still an active member of O.T.O. So a lot of what I do is about teaching and lecturing and writing, and the new book, The Way of the Will, is probably the most recent thing on people's radar. So that's where I'm at.
And also the book Living Thelema, which was very popular.
Living Thelema, the podcast Living Thelema, which I did starting in 2010 and still do occasionally.
So what distinguishes this book? So it's The Way of the Will, Thelema in Action, and how is this different from Living Thelema? I mean, you definitely get into some of the much more advanced topics in this, which I haven't seen people write about ever for actually outside of Crowley. But how would you distinguish this from your other work and other people's work on the topic?
Yeah. So Living Thelema was, grew out of the first sort of big batch of podcast episodes that I did with the Living Thelema podcast. So it, by nature, was a little bit more foundational in terms of the topic. So there's a chapter on true will, there's a chapter on the Holy Guardian Angel, chapter on basic meditation and the LBRP and Liber Resh and stuff like that. The Way of the Will, on the other hand, it's not exactly a sequel. It's more like more broadly and diversely topical. There's a big section on Kabbalistic psychology. As you mentioned, more advanced practices like Liber Thisharp and Liber Yod and things like that just aren't talked about as much. And then, importantly, for me, in terms of sharing with the public, sort of a personal memoir, my own experience with the Holy Guardian Angel in 2004. And so really, it's a different kind of book than Living Thelema, which was designed to be more accessible for beginners, but still have useful things for advanced practitioners too.
So I'm curious because you might have downplayed this a bit, but I will talk you up. You're also one of the legitimate outer heads of the AA, and that's kind of a big deal. But I want to ask you in relation to that, with this book, where is that zone, that comfort zone in between teaching for a private order and putting stuff out to the public? Because this is something that's, I think, stressful for me, and I think anybody in this topic, which is just like, there's all this mythology around, oh, don't let the secrets out, because sometimes you shouldn't, because people take them wrong and behave ridiculously. But but at the same time, it's kind of like there's like that conflicting message of like, don't reveal the secrets, but the entire point of your life should be to help initiate humanity. Like, okay, like where do we go with that? Like, what do you think?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question and an interesting balance for sure. Well, the one obvious point, I suppose, is that in whatever I present to the public, I'm not betraying obligations, private obligations to organizations. Um, of course, with regard to AA, almost everything is by design published, except for things like the details of the ritual initiations and certain words and things. But 99.9% of it's all out there. So that's an easier thing to talk about publicly. But even with being mindful of obligations to O.T.O and Temple of the Silver Star and such, I have found it not that hard to find plenty of things to say that can be public, to advise on practices, to advise on types of practices, even if I'm not saying, and if you're in Temple of the Silver Star, this will remind you of this practice in this degree. There's no reason to say that. People will know.
I see.
So it's I haven't found that too hard to do, but it's something I, of course, am mindful of. Like, how do I keep that balance?
What was the reception to Living Thelema like, and were you surprised by the type of people that picked up that book?
I've been very pleased and flattered by the response to that since the beginning. And it seems to be one of those things. I didn't know it would be this, but it seems to be one of those books that most Thelemites encounter and have on their shelf, unless they decide they hate it and burn it for heat at some point or something. But it's one of those that shows up for people early in their path and maybe guides them. And I think that's wonderful. It's more than I could have hoped for.
Absolutely.
So very pleased.
Did you see people adopting it that were outside of what we might have considered the standard kind of occult community?
I suppose the people within the occult community per se are probably the people I hear from the most. Maybe they have an easier time finding me or something, but I do get the sense that there's been a broader impact in terms of the parts of the book, both books really at this point, that aren't as explicitly magical or occult leaning, but maybe are more psychological and more broadly applicable to people. So I think that is happening too.
Awesome. So that's a good.
I don't know if that's what you meant, but
yeah, no, I'm just curious. Just because I'm just curious because you mentioned this yourself too in the beginning. The world has changed so much in the last 10 years, and also what I would think of is like the people interested in the occult or the occult world that has also utterly changed.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just kind of curious if you'd observed the same, like what you were observing from your corner of things.
Since you put the question that way, I guess what I would say I'd noticed, maybe in the last 5 years or so, specifically, especially, is a bit of a mainstreaming thing going on. I mean, if you would know, on YouTube, you look around and there's all kinds of topics being discussed openly and without any sort of weird vibe that 10 years ago were much more in the margins. And so I think that's wonderful, to get people's awareness raised so that it's not just a knee-jerk kind of reaction.
Yeah. What about, it's like I see all this occult stuff on YouTube or TikTok, and a lot of it is, just delusional.
That's also true.
So there's also that. So it's kind of like I've had to think about this a lot. It's like, there's like, okay, like mainstreaming this stuff on one hand gives more people access to the great work and also creates a smokescreen of cover for the people who are actually doing it. Not that we need it, but the public is pitchforks and, torches and all that. That's just how humanity has always been. So, at the same time, it waters the material down because now it's almost like banished by overexposure. So I
see what you mean.
What do you
think? Yeah. Well, I think both in the YouTube world and online world generally, and also in esoteric publishing, there is a subset of the market which is nicely packaged crap. And and people who realize they can take advantage of that are. And so it does require some fine tuning of the bullshit detector, and experience in the work to be able to know I want something deeper than this, and to be able to realize we want to investigate something further.
So I think that's a really what I would like to ask you then is, from your perspective, how is Thelema in general, specifically the great work of Western, the actual Western magical tradition, how is that different from popular occultism? And I'm thinking of a couple touch points. There's obviously the movie The Holy Mountain, where they kind of go through Pantheon Bar up to the top of the mountain initiation, but also, well, I mean, that's just a good example. But what are your thoughts on that?
Um, well, at least in that the makers of that film were exposed to some deeper traditions, but I think what people often miss if they're only exploring the fringes of occultism and don't dive into a tradition more deeply, like whether it's Thelema or something else, Golden Dawn tradition or something, to miss that the central point of the great work is to elevate the consciousness and have a breakthrough of being, which takes us to a different place as a human being. And I think the easy thing to do is to get fascinated by tools and confuse the tools for the destination. And Crowley was quite clear about that. Any ritual you do prior to KNC is a tool to help you get to KNC, knowledge and conversation, and even things like, you see this in Liber Astarte, for example, even things like worshiping deities, Aphrodite, whatever it is or at least can be construed as practice for those magical muscles of worship that ultimately you want to aim toward the very specific spiritual reality that is your own holy guardian angel. But so I'm mistaking the tools for the destination, I think.
So how would you describe the destination for people who either haven't been exposed to that idea or may not be very clear about it?
I would say in a phrase or two that what we are trying to do in this tradition is help each individual, and thus eventually more and more of humanity as a whole, to have a breakthrough in consciousness that allows them to transcend their identification with the everyday personality and the ego and all the strivings and wants and don't wants that come with that, to transcend that and become conscious of their greater spiritual self and the relationship to what we call the holy guardian angel, but which could have any other term that works for people. The who they are and their place in the universe is much bigger than they ever thought it was. I've often said that when we attain knowledge and conversation, the experience is sort of like, at least for me, and I think for others who have told me about theirs, all of a sudden everything we've ever been makes more sense, but at the same time we realize how much more we are than everything we thought we had ever been. So it's like a transcendence of that, but also a meaning making within our conception of ourselves. So that's a lot more words than I intended to answer your question with, but writ large, that's the great work to me.
Why is that important to humanity and the individual?
Taking a Thelemic stance on that question, I would say that when we understand what the true will is, which is the basic nature and way of being for a person, that what we are trying to do is help each person find themselves and be themselves in the world passionately, vibrantly, hopefully joyously, as much as possible, leaving room for others to do the same. So what you're doing is helping to create a world where more people can be themselves, and in harmonizing with others also doing that, make a world that's an evolved place. And I think that's the individual point, but also the collective point of it.
Why are people not able to just do that out of the gate? I mean,
Some are. Go ahead.
oh, it's always a bit of a contradiction. Well, not necessarily a contradiction, but there's a bit of a tension in dealing with that idea, which is, well, if I have a true nature, why aren't I already that? Why do I need to do yoga and magic and do this weird medieval stuff to get
Right. Right. Well, and I'm not saying that anyone has to do any particular practices to get there. What I am saying is that they need to figure out what's going to work for them if this is a meaningful goal for them. But the reason that anything needs to be done is that we of course embody our true will, but often not very consciously. And what we're more conscious of is all the societal expectations or family upbringing pressures or all the shoulds that we've gradually accrued over the years that tell us what we think we're supposed to be and who we're supposed to be. And so we have to wipe that stuff off in order to see the underlying truth there. So a lot of the initial phase of the great work, in my experience, is just that. It's like clearing away those other things that impede our vision of who we really are. And then, we can fire up the engines to really go for that once we discover it.
Okay. Are there people, whether they're in the Thelemic world or not, or just through history, that you could hold up as perhaps guideposts or exemplars to what that will look like in a human being?
Sure. I'll take a prominent sort of non-magician example, someone I hold in high esteem, like Karl Jung, who wasn't trained in any magical traditions per se, but just started paying attention to himself and his dreams and his symbol sets, and had some crazy experiences, and he made him think he was crazy for a while, as documented in the Red Book, for people who want to see this. And then, like many breakthroughs of consciousness, he spent the rest of his life sort of figuring out how to implement what came through in that experience. And so what started as a revelatory, chaotic sort of am I going crazy thing became the context, or I should say, became the thing that he worked his whole life to build context around, that flowed out into his theories and his practice, and obviously in his influence in the world. So this is what can happen when someone, even outside of tradition, using no traditional magical tools, sort of has an HGA-like experience, in a certain way, and then brings the gold of that back to the world.
Do you feel that there's a difference either in the path or the destination between somebody who does it like that, where it's a bit of a wild talent thing, and somebody who uses a structured initiation system?
Was your question, how is the person likely to be different? How is the result likely to be different?
I think both. But I mean, primarily it's how will, I mean, I'm trying not to pre-color your answer by being clearer than I am, but what's how is that ride for somebody who follows a structure path of initiation versus the ride for somebody who doesn't, and what are the results? Is there a difference in the results and the health of the person afterward?
I guess I could generalize a little bit and say that I think on average, a person is less likely to fall into imbalance and pitfalls and reinventing the wheel if they have some structure, or at least a mentor with a little bit of experience of their own. Not just any mentor, but somebody that's a good fit that knows what they're doing. That said, sometimes structure and organization is the thing that's getting in the way for people, and so those people might do much better figuring it all out on their own and never touching an organization of any kind or having a teacher. But I think on average, again, I would probably generalize to say that Crowley talks about this in the liber causa in terms of AA, but that it is possible to help people make the process more efficient. I'm paraphrasing, more efficient, not fall into pitfalls, not reinvent the wheel.
So that's probably a good place to segue into more of the contents of your book. So you
Okay.
talk a lot about in here about pitfalls along the path, and that's something that people just don't write about very much, probably because they just don't have the experience to write about it. And you talk about shadow work here, which is a phrase that people throw around a lot, of course, but
Yeah, yeah.
you get very, very technical here. And you talk about the essentially activating the negative, the clephotic part of the Sephiroth each time you activate a grade, which is a topic that nobody writes about, which is rather, I think. Talk about that. I mean, talk about kind of the process of shadow work, and also talk about kind of the ordeals of the grades and what kind of happens there. Because I've seen people write about the ordeal of the neophyte, but I've never seen anyone talk about the other ones, which is pretty cool. So
I'm glad you like that. Yeah, it just seemed to me that there's a lot of instructive things to be discussed in terms of what can happen at each of these stages. Ordeal of the neophyte is often, as you noted, discussed as sort of you'll be tempted off the path by a woman. I think as another paraphrase of Crowley there. But setting aside the gender issue there, I think what happens is that we're dealing with an nefesh, in Kabbalistic psychology terms. We're dealing with our encounter with our own unconscious by starting the path. And what happens in our unconscious is sometimes we don't realize the counter impulses we have. Sometimes we don't realize that a part of us doesn't want us to succeed at this or that task, including the great work. The ego might be saying, you don't want to change. Don't do this.
why?
Why? I think the ego doesn't want to lose its grasp on supremacy or its illusion of supremacy in the self. So the idea is, I don't want you to do this work. This is the ego talking. I don't want you to do this work that is endangering your placement of me on the throne, the throne of yourself. And when the ego starts to feel us revering something beyond it, it gets scared and pushes back.
I like how you put that.
And so that's kind of one of the initial ordeals that we can conceptualize all kinds of different ways. But I think that's basically, as initial probation or neophyte in AA terms, moving into Malkuth, those kind of stages of the work. In Yesod, this is the subconscious, that sort of lunar, symbolic, dreamy world of the self, and mastery brings us a greater facility with the language that the astral world and the Holy Guardian angel speak in, initially. The downside is we fall into that and maybe get too obsessed with dreamy fantasy stuff, and we get distracted by that. We get fascinated by, the allure of those mysteries. Hode is, and the Practicus Grade of AA is all about the intellect, and forms of yoga and magic that kind of work with that more specifically. And so the danger there is we fall in our heads and we become one of those brain in a jar kind of armchair magicians that just wants to think about things and do or feel very little. Netzach, the Philosopher's Grade, ideally is firing up our passion, our desire, our aspiration to the divine, but it's also in its own way chaotic and destructive, the way any emotion can be taken so far that you blast someone away with it, as opposed to simply showing it to them or sharing it with them. And then finally, and probably most poignantly, when you get to Tefereth and you've had knowledge and conversation, or the equivalent on a lower octave, whatever sort of system you're working, while that's a spiritual illumination in its fullness, it's spiritual vanity at its worst. Look at me, I'm cool, I made it across the finish line. I've got an HGA, and so and then we're back to an ego sort of possession kind of mentality. So I wanted that was a little bit exhaustive, maybe going grade by grade, but I just wanted to kind of
Please be
give some
exhausted.
pointers.
Please be exhausted.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how are those overcome?
First of all, being conscious of those pitfalls in advance with your eyes open going into it. So, don't be blind to what can happen. And that's probably the most important thing. Sometimes it's a question of competent supervision. So you might have a mentor that says, "Hey, you're kind of falling in your head a bit," or "You've been doing nothing but scrying for 6 weeks, so maybe just do some basic banishings again and get yourself back." So depending on what's being observed, sometimes others can catch it for us. And if we're self-aware and communicative with people who care about us in our lives, sometimes they're the feedback mechanism that's also in the loop that says, "Look, where'd you go? Come back."
Yeah. Yeah. And it seems in my experience, there's almost infinite places to go and not come back along the path.
Yep, there's any number of ways we can get distracted or disillusioned so that we stop working. That's one of the things that happens the most.
What is it that brings you back?
Me personally?
Yeah. And working with students as well.
Oh. Well, again, sometimes it's the nudge from people. Sometimes it's a nudge from the mentor or other loved ones. Sometimes it's we sit in the muck long enough until light breaks through somehow, and then we realize. I think most people can relate to this in life in general. That sometimes you got to feel like shit for a while until you realize what the next step is.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a topic I haven't seen people write about a lot. I mean, one you may remember is, do you remember O.T.O, Edward Peach?
Mm-hmm.
Called in like the 60s, and he wrote one of his books, which are actually interesting. He says, something that people don't understand about magic is every time you, broadly speaking, every time you call forth a principle, you also, evoke its opposite. And so when you're like, for instance, if you're invoking wealth, you're also invoking his idea was if you're calling forth wealth, you're also calling forth the opposite of wealth. So not only do you need to call forth wealth, but you need to bind the opposite. How do you feel about
that? I probably have a bias in this regard that I inherited, and I think it's a useful bias, but a healthy bias, I would say. But I inherited this a bit from my teacher, Phyllis Seckler, or Merrill, and she was always advising that if you feel like you have too much of something, like let's put it on the Tree of Life, if we got too much Gabora, too much fiery Mars energy, rather than spending a lot of focus trying to make less of something, invoke the thing that's the opposite of it. So invoke Jupiter, say invoke something much more expansive and, joyous feeling or whatever, less destructive. So I would say I wouldn't typically give the advice like if you're invoking something, also bind its opposite. But I would say be aware that when you're invoking something, there's always the chance, especially if there's some unconscious, as I said earlier, unconscious counter impulses to the magical aim. You may be saying, "I want wealth," but if a part of you feels guilty about having money, then that's your invocation of poverty right there. You've invoked your own inner conflict around the issue that is supposedly your magical goal. So rather than have to banish it, I think if consciousness is a pretty good banishing in that sense, that you realize, hopefully you have a gain in self-awareness where you realize, oh, there's part of me that kind of doesn't want this result. What do I do about that?
Please talk about Phyllis Seckler, because she's very much an unsung legend in terms of the Thelema in America and the world and establishing so much of this structure. Please talk about her, because I don't think people are
Sure.
often commonly aware about her legacy.
Yep. And that is, in my views, straight up a result of decades and centuries of misogyny around strong women in this field. Um, and yeah, so she was born in the early 1917, early part of the 20th century, Canada. Ended up in the U.S. in Los Angeles around the time that O.T.O's Agape Lodge was flourishing down there. Lived there at the lodge initially as a housekeeper, but then got into the tradition and became Jane Wolfe's magical student. And Jane Wolfe, of course, worked with Aleister Crowley at Cefalù, the Abbey of Thelema. She was a hard worker and an intuitive, um, strong mystic, and of course magician. And during that time in the 50s, she through her work got into AA, as I said, under Jane Wolfe, and then in doing her work attained knowledge and conversation, and ended up at the time, then once Jane Wolfe had died, connecting as a magical student with Karl Germer, who was the head of AA and O.T.O at the time after Crowley's death. So after Germer's death, Phyllis was, in my view, in the view of many, the senior most Thelemite in AA and perhaps on the planet. And then over the years between the early 60s when Germer died and the, say, mid 70s when we saw a real public resurgence of Thelema and O.T.O, she was working behind the scenes throughout on her AA work and supervising students. And in the span of that time, it also started a journal, an organization, the College of Thelema. The original College of Thelema was Phyllis's, and the journal and the Continuum was seminal for many people, just getting some of the basic Thelemic documents, some of the things that had never been published at that time, letters and, chapter by chapter kind of explorations of things like Liber Aleph and things that were very difficult to find for people, especially, pre-internet. And of course, with her husband at the time, Grady McMurtry, was foundational in getting the O.T.O restarted in the late 60s and early 70s, that brought it to be the flourishing thing it is today. And so I think it is not with any exaggeration that I say that modern Thelema just simply would barely exist in a recognizable form if it weren't for her efforts.
I think that must be right. She was also Lon DuQuette's teacher, if I'm correct. And I think some of the other major Thelemic figures are all kind of, yeah. And she was a school teacher as well. Is that right?
High school art teacher.
Okay.
Very, very talented artist. She had sort of the side of painting landscapes, but then also she'd go home and paint these sort of amazing psychedelic, alchemical and magical themed paintings.
Can you see those anywhere? I didn't know that. Are those online or in collections anywhere?
Some of them. I mean, I have some. Marlene Cornelius used to have some prints she was selling of those. I don't know if those are still extant. And her actual paintings are scattered around with people, a lot of the family. But I'm not aware of any like online galleries or things like that.
I would love to see that. I had no idea.
Yeah.
What do you think drove her? I mean, for somebody with such a strong sense of personal mission, with what sounds like zero validation or cueing from the outside world, that's an incredibly strong personality and incarnation. What do you think? What was going on there? What drove her?
I've rarely, if ever, been around someone whose inner light just burned like hers, and she glowed. She just glowed. And I think you can interpret that as, her angel working through her, or you can interpret that as something that is more inherently her, but even prior to her attainment. But what I knew of her, and I knew her for the last decade of her life, was somebody who just really, really cared about making the world more Thelemic and helping people find their own way toward that. And remedying whatever she saw as deficiencies in what was being taught or what was available, or it just clearly a true will thing for her to move it forward and make things available and help people advance.
Did she talk about, did she have a sense of what that world would be like? Like where she,
Did she have a sense of it?
yeah, or talk about it?
She talked about it a lot in terms of, yeah, like hopes and dreams for, a world that, first of all, would have more gender balance. That was something that understandably was on her mind. Um, and seeing, women as heads of organizations and magical organizations and such. But also, she came through the 60s, the Vietnam era. She'd lived through consciously through World War II, and beyond. And so she'd seen the kind of turmoil that would come up when people in the world don't know themselves, don't care to know others, really don't pay attention to their own shadow stuff. And so I think a big part of her meditation was of her will and intention was to right that situation.
Do you have a sense of, a small question, David, do you have a sense of where the current stage of evolution of humanity is at? Because it's been a little rough the last couple of years.
Let me thumbnail that now.
Yeah.
Oh God.
How's it going?
I have to confess to eternal optimism, which is a shameful thing to say in this world, but
it's rebellion.
Yeah, but how many cycles can in my life? I mean, I'm not that old, but I've gone through a number of cycles where everything seemed to be falling apart, and in one greater or lesser extent, and surprising things help us pull through. And I emphasize the surprise part of that because, of course, I don't know what might pull us through this, but I just have enough confidence in the experience of an individual human when I encounter them, that if you add up all those individual humans, there is a beating heart of something that has more common sense and is more caring than the media and that kind of experience might instruct us.
So a big statement. I like that. Yeah, no, it's like my day-to-day average experience of people on any side of the political spectrum is that they're generally sweet, nice people. So
yeah,
I think that's true of Americans in general, except when it's not. How do you feel? Right. Yeah. How do you feel about where do you kind of stand on the mythology around aeons and Crowley as the prophet and there is an inevitable aeon of Horus and we're in it whether we like it or not and all of that?
Right. I'm probably a pretty bad fundamentalist, so I think there is a lot of utility for adopting that worldview and determining if that is what is going to open up one's own true will. If that is the structure and the framework that helps an individual find themselves, find their attain to the HGA and actualize their true will, then great. I think it is entirely possible to live in this world and have a magical path that doesn't accept that at all. And I'm not going to complain if someone finds that what unlocks their door is seeing that as a helpful mythology that is just, a useful fiction, I guess. Whereas another person might deeply hold it as a religious truth. And if that works for them, that's great too. So that's where I tend to land on that.
But since you've been out of the broom closet for a long time, and you're also a working psychologist, I'm actually just really curious. How do you, when this subject comes up with professional colleagues or people who are just not, part of this world, how do you talk about magic if they ask you? I mean, do you just put it in psychological terms, or how do you approach that topic?
you'd be surprised how little that has come up with colleagues. It it probably is more now because my books have been out there longer, and you do a web search and you get all that kind of stuff before you get much about my psychology practice. But pleasantly, I'm finding that people are pretty nonchalant about it. Like, and I'll talk about it as my spiritual path, if asked by a client or a colleague, and I'll talk about it as something that doesn't have to be in the room when we do therapy, but it just informs who I am as a person, just like anybody's personal spirituality would. Um, and in terms of explaining what it is to people, I don't psychologize it away. I do believe there's more to this than, I'm not saying it's all psychology or it's all in our heads and spirits aren't real or any of that. I'm often accused of that, but it's not what I'm saying. And so explaining it is often about helping people use symbols and use the force of their will. And I maybe explain a little bit about the true will concept or something, helping people find themselves. And, by the time I get to the end of a few sentences of that, they're bored anyway. But that's basically what I do.
It's always a really good tactic. Is like when people confront you with stuff, just like sometimes I've done this. Like if people ask me about magic and they're antagonistic, I just start talking about it, but really slowly in an extremely great detail. Just,
just go straight for the weeds.
Yeah. And then they're just like, no. I just lost it. I had okay. So that overlap zone between psychology and magic. I mean, there's a lot to talk about there. One is, where do modern magicians fall on that? Because as magical as we get, we're still 21st century people, and it's very actually I think quite perhaps impossible to fully suspend disbelief. I don't know, but or at least do it completely turn off your rational side, nor would you want to. So there's that kind of question that magicians have about, and often comes up with spirits, obviously, which is how much is real and how much is in my head. But then there's a, maybe I shouldn't ask this as one question, but there's a related topic to that, which is why talk about magic at all? Why not talk about transpersonal psychology, depth psychology, art therapy, like mindfulness? Why bring in presenting what is theoretically supposed to be a future of human consciousness? Why are we including all this medieval nonsense, or what at least appears to be nonsense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and people include greater or lesser degrees of medieval nonsense or other nonsense, so we got to recognize there's a continuum of how many quite old traditional practices are used versus more modern techniques of more modern origin. But I think we should be talking about all of those things, all of those disciplines, and it might be a weirder thing to ignore what is one major tradition of self-transformation, and even just taking magic as a working by working set of tools that has nothing to do with the true will or the HGA. I think we find that it's a method of focusing intention. It's a method of increasing self-awareness of different types of energy within ourselves and refining our ability to put them to use. So I think there's a lot of things to merit it, just like the self-knowledge that grows out of therapy or self-analysis, or the change that can grow out of, as you say, art or art therapy or something. So I think everything has its place, and perhaps we just have to find our own cocktail that works well.
So it sounds like what you're saying, it's kind of like there's all this stuff on the buffet, and each individual person is going to have to find what's at the buffet table that works for them.
Yeah, the mix of things, and at the right time. Sometimes the chicken salad's good. Sometimes you need to wait for it.
Gotcha.
just to reduce this to ridiculousness.
Yeah. Well, if we're talking about ceremonial magic, you're talking in this book about the Golden Dawn and how it relates to
Yeah,
Thelema. And I want to spend some time on this because I think this is something that I comes up when I'm talking with students a lot, and is something that is not clear. I think that there's even online you see antipathy between the two traditions as if they're separate, which I personally don't think they are at all. But
sure.
I'm curious your take on this.
Well, it obviously may not be obvious to people who haven't learned much about Crowley's origin story, but he of course got his training in the Golden Dawn, Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, starting with his initiation in 1898, about 10 years after they were founded, and his whole initial worldview of the magical, the import of magical work and ceremonial orders and magic and mysticism in general came out of the Golden Dawn largely, and then he gradually sort of refined that and personalized it and brought his own revelations to the party. But it's a continuum of a tradition. It's not two separate things, and I think many non-Thelemite magicians, and in particular, I guess it's true that there's been some antipathy between the Golden Dawn tradition and Thelema. I think a lot of that is falling prey to the same sort of misunderstandings that the general public has about Crowley from essentially the tabloid press of the 1920s and beyond, that had nothing to do with his real life's work. And so if that can get rationalized, like, oh, Crowley was too much into the sex or too much into drugs to make sense, or was too much of a narcissist to have anything of value, or people can do kind of selective character assassination that way and then invalidate his whole system. But I think if we look with open eyes at the tools in the system and don't get distracted by the trappings and the public pillorying he always went through, I think we can find some important tools there. So that would be my hypothetical advice to the hypothetical Golden Dawn practitioner who's sitting here with us and
Okay.
criticizing Crowley. And likewise, flip that around. I think sometimes the Golden Dawn tradition is written off because of Crowley's sort of elaborations and, in some cases, simplifications of the magical process to reduce some of the verbosity and proceduralization of the Golden Dawn traditions. I think often you hear some Thelemites maybe being critical of the Golden Dawn tradition as if it's fussy or just old aeon and doesn't have anything of value anymore, and forgetting that, like, Crowley used the LBRP till the end of his life and taught it, the classic version, not the Star Ruby, and obviously was standing on the shoulders of previous traditions. So, long answer, but a good question.
Please take as long as you need. It's a podcast. That's what we're here for. We're here to know what you know. So, Crowley, at this point in your life, having now been in these orders and taught, and I'm also guessing having done work and dwelt with this for so long, and I'm guessing having access probably to archives and private documents and things like this. And I'm going to ask you this at the deepest possible non-surface whatsoever level. Who do you think Aleister Crowley actually was? What is your take on him now at this point?
Mm.
It's not a rhetorical question. I'm actually curious.
Yeah. I see him as, this may come as no surprise to those knowing my biography, but I see him as someone very much like Carl Jung, in the sense that he had an expansive intellect and ability to find and synthesize diverse resources and traditional tools and build on them and systematize them, and so whereas Jung tended to do that in terms of comparative mythologies and religious systems and such. Crowley's doing that in explicitly in magical traditions and such. And so even setting aside one's belief or non-belief in his prophet status and whether or not one sees the succession of the aeons as being an important part of their worldview, I think we've got Crowley standing out as a systematizer and somebody who had really deep insight into the way human beings evolve, the way consciousness evolves, the way tools can help consciousness evolve. So that's, but I my whole thing is teaching within organizations. So, what I value a lot is the systems he left behind for us to work with.
Got it. And so you think that's do you feel that it's a complete system or that it needs additions or updating? Do you feel it's complete as given?
I think it's a great question. I think there have been helpful additions since Crowley's day. And that's, for example, one thing we're trying very explicitly to do within Temple of the Silver Star is utilize everything else we've learned about humanity between 1888 and now. So going far beyond what a strictly traditional Golden Dawn approach might do, incorporating mystery schools that have existed in our sort of lineal tradition since then, modern psychology, depth psychology, modern science, all of Crowley's work, so what we can see happening in a living tradition right now, and not just with Temple of the Silver Star, is people working within an overall Thelemic framework, and maybe even within specifically AA framework, but also keeping it alive with new discoveries. And if something got calcified so much that there was no room for evolution, then that would be a dead system.
One thing I wanted to ask you about is just the concept of will itself, because when Crowley was writing, will was a very popular. It was a buzzword, and now we have a different understanding of will. Like just even just in the, whenever it was where people started talking about actually will is a finite resource that you deplete by making decisions throughout the day. Where do you stand on that in terms of, because will, I may not be correct about this, but my sense of why he said true will is just that that was in the culture at the time from Nietzsche and Schopenhauer and people like that, and German idealism, and that it was a phrase that people used more. And we don't really talk about, in fact, we almost treat people like the opposite, as if they have no willpower now. But we have a different, I guess, neurological understanding of what willpower is now. Is that something you've kind of looked at?
I think the main confusion with the word is what is actually meant by true will versus the concept of everyday will power and will in terms of decision making and desires and will as wants, basically, as opposed to the true will as a phrase I've used earlier today, basic nature. It's our way of being in the world. It's not a finite resource of wanting things that we run out of when we make too many decisions. It's our whole process of living when stripped down to its bare essentials.
So it's really not about willpower at all then. It's more of a transcendent purpose.
To me, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law to me, means there is a divine will flowing through you, particularized to your unique strengths and nature. And your job is to do that will and live it out instead of merely doing what you want. And that's throwing a whole lot more words at it. And I don't care if anyone else sees it the same way or adopts that kind of worldview on it. But to me, it's so different from saying, that it's choice making in a simple way or exertion of will or intention in a certain way. It's much more about that opening up to be a vessel of divine will flowing through us in our particular unique channel, you know?
Yeah, there's one thing that occult people often do, and I'm curious what you think about, which is it's very easy to be like, when you make mistakes and things fall apart, just say like, oh, well, clearly that was my true will. I just needed to go through this experience. I think you even mentioned this in the book. It's like, you talk about a move. I also just went through, I think, well, I also just went through a fairly dramatic move. So, and it's easy to look back and say like, well, that had to happen. And that's very psychologically comforting to do.
Yeah.
But it could also be utter delusion, you know?
Yeah. And that can be a useful delusion or a problematic delusion.
Okay.
But yeah, certainly there's there's a non-zero chance, as they say, of retrospective shoehorning of everything into, you know, obviously that was essential to my path that brought me here, because of course everything that's happened to us has brought us here. But I do think there's also value in reflecting on our path and seeing how certain choices, certain choices and patterns of choices start to form a discernible image of the true will. Like, I could see where the river was flowing and where tributaries were flowing into it because of all of these choices that were made and circumstances I found myself in. And it makes sense to me because I get that my basic nature is of this particular character. And, you know, so now that makes more sense. And that's usable delusion, if nothing else. But I think it tends to be more than that.
Hmm. One thing that affected me a lot actually in my 20s, and which I feel is potentially an inherent kind of potentially an inherent issue with Magick, and specifically Thelema, is the kind of the delayed living. What I mean by that is it's really easy to get into the zone of like, you know, I'm not gonna live life until I know for sure what my true will is. And then 10 years go by where you're just doing occult practices and you realize you could have been living your life.
Yeah.
Is this something you encounter?
Yeah, there's two sides to that. I think one, at least two sides. Um, it certainly is possible to get lost in tools and to essentially set aside taking action because we're too scared of making wrong choices that aren't in conformity with true will that we don't know yet, so we better not act, you know. But everything's practice, you know, all the time. And that includes magic, and it's okay to practice. And through successive approximations, through practice, will in fact get clues about the true will, and that's great. So I certainly don't counsel a course of inaction due to fear of not acting on true will. The flip side, as I was hinting at, is this takes too long. I just want to get to the advanced stuff right now. It'll get me to it faster, you know. And then what happens is they weren't ready to do that work. They needed more preparation. They need more foundational materials and experience. And so it ends up taking longer than it would have if they had just followed a stepwise path, because they fall into pitfalls, get distracted, don't realize what they didn't know, and have to go back and fill in those holes. And so there's doesn't tend to be a fast track, and often what people think is a fast track is actually a slow track.
How do you feel about when Crowley starts talking about a shortcut to initiation?
I think there certainly can be judicious shortcuts, and we can learn over time our own shortcuts, and organizationally we can learn like ways to maximize the efficiency of a student's process, strip out inessentials. So I think there's certainly merit in stripping out inessentials and refining and simplify the process as much as it can be simplified. But go ahead.
At this point, what would you say is most essential and what is inessential?
This may sound like a cop-out answer, but really most essential is persistence. because when we stop, and if we're moving, we're not stuck. So don't stop moving and striving and persisting in what you're trying to do, whether no matter what tradition or what field of endeavor. Least essential. The longer I go, the more I believe that specific beliefs per se are not that essential, and specifically like doctrines and dogmas.
You mean just any doctrine? Like not a specific, do you mean specific doctrines or just having a doctrine?
The idea that in order for things to work, we have to believe certain things.
Okay.
As opposed to an open-ended exploration of tools to determine what we believe.
I like that.
So it's straight up a scientific illuminist approach, as Crowley might describe it, which is try stuff and decide what you believe, as opposed to you must believe this or else you're either going to hell or simply going to not attain as a magician.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always very disconcerting to me to meet people who like truly believe that Crowley was the prophet, and it's like like almost like in a Mormon sense. Yeah, that's very disconcerting to me. I have a technical question though. Previously, you asked, you were talking about Crowley doing the LBRP to the end of his life. I have never been fully clear on the difference between the LVX and Knox formulas and why the banishings are different and what they are used for differently and at what period, at what point along one's journey when they are used and why. And I've never been, despite doing those rituals forever, I've never fully been satisfied with my understanding of that.
That's a big topic. I may need a more specific question.
Okay. All right. Let me narrow it down then. What is the Knox? What are the LVX and Knox formulas?
Yeah, good starting place. So writ large, the LVX formula is the formula that gets one to the HGA. And I'm going to oversimplify, of course. And the Knox formula is the formula that gets us from the knowledge of conversation across the abyss. One is an aspiration by the aspirant, the LVX formula, the aspirant aspiring to the one star insight, as we might call it, the HGA. This has nothing inherently to do with the dying God formula, which probably felt was one of those old aeon things that should be left behind in a certain sense. It's all about let's focus our aspiration to one central, symbolically solar goal. Okay. And then having attained that, once we realize we're that star in the sky, the sun, having attained that, the next step for us is to find ourselves as one of many stars in the heavens, symbolically. So, having attained individuality, we then prepare to let go of that individuality to maximize our service to the world. We offer ourselves into the Grail of Babylon, as Crowley might have said. So that's the big picture of those formulae. But as they're used in specific rituals, with, for example, the lesser ritual of the hexagram that traditionally would incorporate the LVX formula, that would be more common. Well, traditionally, the hexagram ritual would not have showed up in a person's training system until the second order of the Golden Dawn system. So a person would have been working with exclusively pentagram rituals up to that point, and then have the hexagram rituals added now that they're identified with the sun, via the Tefereth attainment. The Knox formula and the Knox signs and things show up in publicly available rituals like the Star Ruby. And essentially in that ritual format, what the magician is doing is first centering themselves in the four elements with the preliminaries of the star ruby, and then working with the quarters, and then climbing up the rest of the tree to the supernal realm using the Nox signs as leverage. So, in a technical ritual sense, that's how they're used. I think, in terms of the formulae, but basically you can use the LBRP and LBRH as preliminaries before invoking any specific element or planet or zodiacal sign. The star ruby is only a banishing. There's no invoking form. Likewise, the star sapphire is sort of an adaptation of a hexagram ritual, but it's only an invoking. There's no banishing form of that. So those are
Why is that?
neither. Why is it?
Yeah.
If you look at the structure of the star sapphire, it has some uncanny resemblance to Liber Samek and the climactic parts of that, where we're straight up invoking the holy guardian angels. So it's a power up ritual, and it to me is almost like a shorthand reworking of the KNC working. Because of that, it's just like bringing in some of that same feeling of aspiring to the highest, and then being totally receptive to the flow of that. And now, not everyone approaches that ritual in that way, but that's my particular approach to the Star Sapphire is that. So that's a lot of different kinds of answers to that question, but hopefully circling it enough.
So theoretically, one wouldn't do because the obvious temptation is just to see the Star Ruby and Sapphire as the quote unquote new Aeon versions of the Golden Dawn,
right?
But it seems that they are actually completely different technically, or a different purpose.
That is my opinion, and continues to be after a few decades of using them and helping other people use them, that they don't fully replace the more traditional versions.
Interesting. When Crowley talks about the formula of the Aeon of Horus being like the jet turbine compared to the Model T, what is he talking about? What is he actually talking about when he talks about the magic of the Aeon of Horus and the new formula and all of it, and it's going to be super powerful and like a nuclear bomb? What is he actually talking about?
Well, I think you could have 100 different answers to that depending on which Crowley thing you're reading, excuse me. Because he writes about it in different ways in different places, of course. But I think the big picture there is that he felt that the Aeon of Horus would be a freeing up of energy that had been bound up in old Aeon patterns and repressions, and if you think about the last couple thousand years before Crowley, and all of the repressive consciousness that was out there, body negativity, sex negativity, freedom negativity, commandeering of divine, the idea of divine accessibility only through a priest class and all that sort of stuff. You let go of all that, and you've got a world that can develop into a world that is so much freer and has so much of that energy accessible instead of being repressed or just stuck, so I think that's probably a broad and important way to understand it.
This is an extremely dangerous question, but I might as well ask it.
Excellent.
So Thelema, okay, the chances of Thelema actually being adopted as a religion for the West, as Crowley thought it should be, right now we're in what I interpret, and have been for like my entire adult life, in this cultural abyss, meaninglessness. And right now you see, I don't know if you follow this at all, but you have a bunch of cultural commentators like people like Ian Hersey Ali, or historian Neil Ferguson, or people like that, who are now kind of within the last year have been, in response to the current world situations, kind of posing that the West again become culturally Christian so that we at least have a guiding principle. My response is yes, and that's the worst idea ever. But because I think it seems like, I mean, the world, let me put it this way. The world you just described makes sense. It's rational and feels right. And in my opinion, the ultimate trajectory of Thelema is getting to a Star Trek: The Next Generation future. But that's just my personal take. I think people probably share that. I hope. But what do you like? Maybe the question here is like, man, like, do we really need to actually start actively pushing that?
Mm. Well, I mean, obviously, I'm not going to say what we need is a to go back to uniformly
It's a
Christian
dangerous.
culture.
It's just a
Yeah,
thought experiment. Thought experiment.
yeah, yeah. Um, gosh, it's reminding me of some of the the studies that I've seen out of social psychology over the years that traditionally we're associating authoritarian regimes with hardship. When times are harder, people reaching out for more intense structure, wartime, poverty, etc., leading to a desire for more control um, from above. And I think maybe there's some of that in the mix there. If people are feeling like things are spiraling out of control, then control's the answer. You know, um, but sometimes we just have to keep spiraling out of control until the pieces land in the new way. And that's not necessarily comfortable, and it's certainly not something that happens without some growing pains. But I don't think the solution is restriction,
Okay.
which is essentially what that would be, like imposing a restriction of what we are
So you
onto.
think? So you say even like impose like positing that Western culture should be thelemic is imposing restriction, is imposing a restriction.
I, yeah. I mean, if you think of Thelema in the same sort of in an oversimplified religious way, where the idea is that there's a Thelemic temple on every corner, and that's the state religion or something. Um,
You must be
but
yourself, citizen.
yeah, be yourself now or
Not being
suffer.
yourself.
And
Not conforming.
yeah, yeah. So, but if a Thelemic world means everyone's encouraged to find themselves and be themselves,
Yeah.
whether they call it Thelema or not, I'll vote for that.
Well, I definitely think that America is and the West in general is becoming the limit. I think whether you put supernatural stuff on it or you just say Crowley was very tapped into human nature. Um, the Book of the Law is as far as I can tell an accurate observation of what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And it appears to have absolutely nothing to do whatsoever with magic or magical orders at all. Like it's just happening, and this is my take. I'm curious if you have a different one. Actually, my take is basically like the aeon's happening whether you like it or not, and the path of initiation is like if you want to get to the eye of the storm, so your life isn't just utterly destroyed by all these forces. Like that's the kind of the Thelemic path isn't. It doesn't create the aeon. It's kind of the path through the aeon in a way that I
Yeah,
suppose Christianity could have been a path through the misery of the Middle Ages.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I agree. I mean, it's like saying the new Aeon model is like saying, here's how the universe is starting to work. So if you want to navigate it, get on board with working in that way. Think about it that way, instead of fighting it or identifying with the way things were. Therefore, any change is catastrophic and overturning and scary. We got to kind of ride the beast, so to speak, and trust that in the wildness of that, we end up where we need to go, even if we don't know where that is and can't control it in the ways we're used to. But I think there's an argument, perspective on Crowley that is Crowley as narrator of what's already happening,
Yeah.
as opposed to the thing that made it happen.
Yeah, I think so. At least that's my take on it. And I think that in many ways also the disturbing things about Crowley are just mirroring things in the world. I mean, like nothing, somebody observed something like nothing Crowley ever did even comes close to what the average person does online every day or sees.
Yeah.
It's just like Yeah.
I mean, well, the ridiculous taking that anti-Crowley stance to its ridiculous extreme. I mean, look, what he actually did in his life was more like, as is often said, being a hippie too soon, or
Right. Well, there's
experimenting with.
disturbing things too. I mean, it's not like
Yeah,
he's
yeah, yeah, yeah.
never clean, but
I'm not. I'm not
he's also
having him
dead.
to dinner, but yes,
Or you
but
wouldn't have dinner. Really? You would not have Crowley to dinner.
of course I would. But I bet by the end of it, I would be taking him in small doses.
Did he ever?
As a,
Is the story about him shitting on somebody's carpet in England true?
I don't know.
You've heard the story, right?
I have, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I hope.
But what I was what I was kind of getting to is just that. Okay, take the worst things he's been accused of. Uh, maybe not the worst things in terms of harming humans directly or something, but compare that to one dictator who's dropped one bomb. I mean,
Yeah.
the scale of what actually happens in the world that people don't say, oh, that world leader is the wickedest man alive. Look at all the bombs he just dropped. Instead, we look at Crowley and say that's insane.
It shows. I mean, Crowley is like the walking lesson in psychological projection.
Yeah,
Somehow.
absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting stuff. Who are the secret chiefs, David, and how do I meet them?
Well, you've seen Sesame Street, right?
I have seen Sesame Street.
Yeah. That's a clue. I'm just bullshitting.
Yeah. Wait. Why is that a clue? That sounds like you were actually trying to say something.
No, actually, I just pulled that out of my whatever.
It has the initials SS.
Good point. Yeah. See, we're already approaching transrational truths here. But a serious answer to that question is that it is, for me, it's been my experience that there are non-human guides, maybe formerly human, maybe always non-human, that we can get our heads in the right place to get instruction from that help us do things in life. And one of those most personally would be the Holy Guardian Angel, in my experience. But sometimes those guides seem to be directing currents of evolution and instruction that take form in a magical school of some kind. And therefore, it's sort of the impulse of those so-called secret chiefs to make sure this avenue of training is available to people. And as with everything else I've said here today, it's not important to me whether anyone believes that outright. We always tell people that we just want you to trust that we've tried these tools and we want you to try them and make up your own mind, basically. And the concept of the secret chiefs is one of those things that doesn't require belief, but is just offered as a good faith sense of this is what we've experienced and feel has been happening.
Have you had occult experiences that upon long reflection truly cannot be explained rationally, psychologically, or scientifically?
To me, yes. I feel even just confining it to a question like the material that came through in the aftermath of my thought and conversation experience, things that I know I didn't know, things that I know I couldn't have thought of, things that interlock in ways that I cannot explain, even if thinking, this was in my unconscious and it just took this sort of breakthrough and blast to get them out. It just doesn't feel like that. I've had that in other ways, in other situations, and things are just qualitatively different. And I can't explain it psychologically.
Yeah, and of course, I'm guessing you've had enough experience to distinguish things from psychedelic or chemical experiences, also.
Yeah.
What is okay? So what is it qualitatively? I mean, like Crowley talks about checking things with Kabbalah and things like that, but what is it qualitatively about those experiences that were different from all the other altered states you'd experienced?
I don't know if I want to pin it down to Crowley, but I think in general, the quality that's different between well, I was answering this question to somebody the other day. Um, Samadhi is accessible in all kinds of ways, in all kinds of contexts, cosmic consciousness of some kind. Okay. And yet sometimes that cosmic consciousness is aligned precisely with our own unfolding path in a unique way. So it's not just, wow, I'm one with everything. It's, wow, I'm one with everything. And this is my particular mission amongst the everything. And, the specificity, I think, is what sets it apart in quality from a more general ecstatic experience or like psychedelic experience. Or Crowley points this out in the Scullion to Liber Samec, that you can go to a tent revival and get fired up and ecstatic, but if it doesn't change you in a way that you can walk out of there and be different and evolve the world differently and do something concrete with it, then all you've got is kind of a spiritual party, and then it's over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a funny way to look at it. Um, when Crowley talks about preterhuman intelligences and the only hope for humanity is contacting them, the hell is he talking about, really? What do you think?
Mm. I think I think we can understand some of that as projection of the inner journey, the inner reaches of outer space, as Joseph Campbell might have said, or the way that we, even Jung said, he felt like the whole UFO craze of the 50s was like people projecting the idea of selfhood onto these discs in the sky, So I think,
what did he mean by that? I actually haven't read his essay about that, and that's really interesting, given that people are now obsessed with aliens again.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's just more broadly coming off Jung for a second. I think it's just a yearning for transcendence and beyondness. Um, there may also be a mix in there of desperation. One version or another of save us from ourselves. Three body problems. Interesting.
Oh, the Chinese. I listened to a little bit of the audio of the one, but I didn't get very far. How would you relate that?
I'm just fresh off the TV series, so I'm afraid I haven't read the book. But certainly the idea that some people want us to be saved from ourselves, and maybe some don't, is interesting. So I think the UFO craze and any of its manifestations over the years is, I'm using UFO alien sort of sloppily, but you know what I'm saying. That whole thing, taken as a psychological phenomenon, which it doesn't have to be limited to, but taking it that way is, to me, a lot about wanting to be beyond ourselves somehow, wanting our universe to be bigger than us. And that can be true the way an individual feels too. I want to be more than me, collectively. We want to be more than we are. But I think it would be incredibly, just to speak on the concrete level for a minute, I think it would be incredibly earthocentric to think that there weren't other intelligent beings out there. It's just, where do we see them? Where do we find them? And how do we decide we found them? Which is the muddy part.
One thing that I think occultists can often start to think, which makes them seem crazy and does not make sense to anyone else, is that uh, forms of consciousness can be aliens. What do I mean by that? Like the praetor, like the non-human intelligence doesn't necessarily have to have a body. It can be a thought form. But it is independent. Is that? It's like meaning like aliens can come from inner space is maybe a more glib way to say that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That matches up with your experience.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't have it myself tended to use the term aliens, but more like
it's a shorthand.
Yeah, absolutely. That I again would be very human consciousness centric to decide that other forms of consciousness had to be embodied in the same way or couldn't communicate with us in more subtle ways? Interesting question.
Do you think that it's possible that oh no, I shouldn't say that, sorry. I hate when people do that to me. I'm sorry. What was I going to say? Do you think that there's factionality among non-human intelligences? Like, for instance, Crowley talks about the schools of magic.
Yeah. I have sometimes, yes, I've had the feeling in one particular instance, which I'll keep private, but it left me with the sense that there may be sometimes conflicting aims among what we might conventionally call the secret chiefs that not war per se, but it was sort of like one school of thought works a certain way, another works another certain way, and now we're working together on this joint mission, even though we have some divergence in the way we work. So that's what I can say about it.
So maybe a more practical way to look at that is: do you think, for instance, do you think that there's actually like a distinction between, just to be as crass as possible, like Western and Eastern schools, right? It's like Western mysticism and Eastern mysticism. Do you think those things are actually separate?
I like the kind of perennial model idea of spokes in a wheel, where all the traditions are different, especially when considered in more exoteric ways. And then as each draws closer to the center, each tradition has a spoke, and as each draws closer to the center, there's less differentiation.
Mm.
So the mystical aim, the mystical revelation, tends to be much more similar tradition than the basic practices or what a church service looks like, one versus the other, and so on.
How do you feel about modern Christianity in America?
Great. No, not really. It sure is interesting to see who practices any religion in a thoughtful way versus who doesn't, and what I see a lot of in American Christianity at this point is a breakdown of the idea of a religious system as a way of living, and more like a way to create divisions or to create identity different from someone else. And most crassly in the public eye now, of course, is just the co-opting of political lines as also religious lines.
Yeah.
And, that's quite troubling.
It's very troubling. And I did not I don't know how you feel, but I grew up, I was a teenager in the 90s. And so I just kind of had this idea that because the 90s were the way that they were, that it was just going to be like that forever and just keep getting better and better. And I didn't expect the 9/11 and the resurgence of theocracy around the world. And it just it doesn't seem to be a blip either, because it was easy, perhaps at the beginning, I could say like, oh, well, this is just kind of like the dying echo of the old Anne or something like that. But yeah, that might be echoing for a while.
Yeah. How far is the pendulum going to swing before it starts to come back a bit? And that's really the big question. And this comes back to what I was saying earlier about my optimism, in that as long as individuals make choices, I have hope.
Okay.
And as that pendulum swings further and further out in one direction, my sense is that what people tend to do is there's more and more people exerting those choices to say, maybe this is far enough now, and that just becomes eventually a critical mass to pull that thing back, So I think we can all only do what we can do, and what we need to do is our part in being one of those voices that tries to rein in the extreme.
I like that. I think that's happening right now. I feel in
Yeah,
the last year, things have, well, you say it in the beginning of your book that, our lives now are probably unrecognizable to who we were 10 years ago.
yeah,
And I think that people at this point are just like, we would very much like things to go back to normal.
yeah,
Can we just chill? Can I just take a break for a little bit? Okay.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
do you have a sense of, I mean, you notice it enough to call it out at the very beginning of this book. So what are your, like, do you have thoughts on why that is? And also what the kind of proper, I mean, you've touched on it already, but kind of what the proper thelemic response to that should be.
Mm. So you mean a thelemic response to extremity in this particular
The
way?
state of the world. I mean, what you're
Yeah,
commenting on in the beginning of the book, just how
yeah,
much everything has changed in the last 10 years. And you say it stripped us down to the essentials, which I thought was interesting.
yeah. Keep the focus on discovering our essentials, and that's just kind of a coded way of saying, increase our focus on understanding our true will and living it out, because no matter what is going on around us, that's not going to be wrong. You know, that is a genuine connection with true will is what the world needs by definition, because the true will of an individual is, and I believe this is true, that embedded in the theory of what it even is that it is in harmony with universal will, right? So a chorus of different kinds of voices that harmonize and get universal will actualized. And so it's never going to be the wrong choice to say, I'm pretty fucking confused by the world right now, but let me figure me out. That's
Yeah,
never going to be the wrong thing.
I like that. Yeah, it's like that I always tell people like, just bet on yourself, invest in yourself, because at least that's real. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, it's a really crazy time and it's a really troubling time. And I think one thing that I try to work in a little bit into every episode is just maybe a call a little bit, not too much, but a call for a little bit of solidarity in the new age and also the atheist world, where it's just like
Mm. Yeah.
we have a common danger right now. We are all threatened by a common thing. So I think
Yeah. Yeah.
the cult world is infamous for infighting
Yeah.
and the tyranny of small differences, and like we're all Satanists to these people. So
Yeah.
it's like we're all the same to them.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I think that it's unfortunate that but Crowley talks about this, the war for individual liberty. It's like, well, it's become a lot more
Yeah.
real than I expected it would, but here we are. So I was
Mhm.
gonna read in 2021 after I left California, I reread Freedom as a Two-Edged Sword.
Mhm.
I was like, everything in here is about this was in the 50s, but everything, or 40s, whenever it was written, it was like, this is everything that's happening now. And I did a reading of it. I was going to release it as a podcast, but I don't know who has the copyright. I don't want to piss off Bill Breeze. So, you know, maybe if somebody's listening to this and they're okay with me releasing that, it wouldn't be for profit. That would be awesome, because I think people need to hear that again.
Yeah. Valuable stuff in there for sure. And, um, I think across the century, 120 years since the Book of the Law, there's probably been various times when really stark things were happening where we could say, wow, this is the Thelemic paradox in action here, having the freedom, but needing to wield it responsibly. And yeah, so seconding your point.
What do you think of Barson's technically? I mean, as a from the not the legend, but technically.
Mm-hmm. Got a bias there because my teacher knew him and did not have the highest opinion of him as a person.
Okay, please say more.
um,
Please, please.
um, well, I think she just felt that he was a bit narcissistic, or at least self-involved and self-important
Okay.
in a way that got in the way of more productive action. But I don't think even she would have disagreed with the acuity of some of his observations, like in that essay. Um, but I'm just speaking for myself. I admire is passionate about a lot of the things he did, and of course, you know, scientifically, and some of his, his professional life had some interesting twists and turns that I admire. I think he probably fell into the same pit as a lot of would-be occultists do, who are modeling after people they deem to be prophets. That, being the next one becomes awfully important.
Well, yeah, it's kind of, once you're in that paradigm, the only way you can kind of identify yourself, disentangle and individuate yourself from the projected father of Crowley or something like that is to be, well, I'm an even bigger prophet than him. Yeah, now I have the balance.
That's right, and consequently, also, I'm more important than my peers. And I think there's that.
I'll admit I've fallen into that in my path. Absolutely, it's really embarrassing. It's really cringe and really painful.
Yeah, I think we all battle with ego stuff one way or another, and that never stops.
And so you feel it never stops, and do you think that it comes back in new ways?
I think, anytime you're on the threshold of a growth process, whatever corner of your ego is challenged by that is going to fight back, and that can get bigger and louder in its worst cases over time, the further you go. Or fortunately, I think for many people, your sense of catching it, your ability to catch it and not feed into it, increases, as does your attainment. So we've certainly seen horrific examples of that not working, but I think in general, the ego never goes away, and as long as the ego isn't going away, you'll always need to be on the lookout for the traps, connected with that. I think that's the biggest thing.
Okay. Yeah, that's also, I think, I'm really curious about your opinion about healthy and ego integration, because that really does seem to be a major stumbling block of occult people, where it's not really, we have all this stuff from the 60s of like, hey, delete your ego, man, on Orange Sunshine Acid. But, this antagonistic, we have this antagonistic idea to the ego that it has to be obliterated.
Right.
Where that came from, I don't know. But this is something that people, and it can become another one of those things like, I won't start living until my ego is disintegrated, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. But
give me a call after ego death.
Yeah. So where do, as a teacher, but also as a psychologist, where do you stand on that question of healthy ego and healthy? Let me say this: healthy ego integration and healthy shadow integration.
Mm-hmm. It's all self-awareness, right? I mean, the ego is like, well, the problem with the ego is that it thinks it's in a place of primacy, as I was hinting at before, when really it is simply the outer interface of our real self with the world. Putting it simply. And so we just have to recognize the right role of the ego and the right relationship of the ego to all the other parts of us. And I go into this quite a bit in the Kabbalistic psychology section in the book. So paired with that, shadow awareness, the shadow is any unacknowledged part of self, essentially. So if we are relentless in our desire to uncover the unacknowledged parts of ourselves, then we are not a slave to them. They're affecting us. They're always affecting us. And so the only thing to do is either be aware or don't be aware. And, one has much better results in terms of the way our lives tend to go. So I think it's incredibly important to deepen and broaden our understanding of our ego and its functioning alongside the shadow, and then mainly just put everything in its right place. That's really the central task.
Do you think that Freud's model of ego, id, etc., is still a workable model at all?
I mean, I obviously as a Jungian leaning person, I tend to expand that model a bit into the places Jung took it, where it's not quite as neatly tripartite that way as Freud had. I think it's got some theoretical advantages to understanding certain human processes, but you know, um, obviously there's a lot of science in terms of outcome studies and looking at what helps change people that would quite understandably cause people to doubt the system as a be all end all, certainly.
Interesting. So you have a chapter about Nuit in here, and I'm curious about where you stand, unless it's forbidden to talk about, where you stand on the cosmology of the Book of the Law now, and what you think those beings actually are. Or who is Aiwass also? Let's just start with that. What is Aiwass?
Okay. So this may sound like, after all of this other discussion, a fairly conventional answer to that. Okay. But the idea is that Aiwass is Crowley's holy guardian angel. This is an entity that revealed the as part of the revelation of the Book of the Law, and also not just Crowley's HGA, just in quotes, but also an important figure in the unfurling of the Aeon of Horus overall, right? So I'd say, to put in the terms that we've already used in this interview, one could look at Aiwass as the holy guardian angel and the secret chief that are behind Crowley's work in the world and the development of that as a particular school. So that's Aiwass.
Okay.
He certainly seemed to believe that Aiwass was an external entity that was talking to him and revealing these things, rather than something like a higher self.
What do you think about when he goes on he starts talking about Aiwass as a Sumerian deity, and that Thelemic revival of the Sumerian tradition?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that he does talk about that in some places. I think that's one of those things that maybe gets overplayed in terms of like, oh, this is what it's all about, period. Because that not necessarily a thread that carries through, all the rest of his life in vibrant ways or something.
It seems he basically said that right at the end, right?
It was a later writing. I'm forgetting at the moment, like exactly where that was. But
so then, what about Nuit, Hadit, and Rahu Quit?
Yeah, so I experience these as universal processes and principles and realities. Just like almost like laws of physics embodied as deities.
So good examples of how you experience those forces in your day-to-day practical life be?
When the point of view with which I go out and attack the world each day is sort of a Hadith thing for me. The embracing of everything going on and the feeling of lack of separateness from that is a Nuit thing for me. The balance of those and choice making that results from that balance is a Rahu Quit thing for me. So these are like the building blocks of everyday experience.
Cool. That's super cool. That's very helpful.
Good.
Thank you.
It's a good question.
Thank you. Okay. You talk about finding a teacher in this book.
Mm-hmm.
Do we want to touch on the lineage wars, or rather perhaps a better way to look at it is anyone who walks into this world right now is basically walking into, the aftermath of a pizza party where everything's on fire and people are running around with their hair on, screaming at each other about why it didn't work and all this. So anyone who steps into this world is going to encounter And even it kind of obliquely mentioned this in the book, kind of the online social media wars with Thelema, which seems to amount to a paper chase. Um, yeah, how does someone navigate this? And also, like, I'll just breach the question, and you don't have to answer it, but kind of the question about lineage
Yeah.
authenticity. You don't
Yeah.
have to
Yeah.
answer it if you don't want to, for because I understand it's extremely volatile.
Well, I mean, and I've always said publicly that, and in fact, it is our policy within AA, not to speak publicly or just sort of assessing the legitimacy of any other claimant group. I use the term claimant group because that is the de facto reality of a group that claims something. So um, rather than the somewhat fraught lineage term, I think what is evident is that there's one way to look at lineage as a simple teacher to student transmission. And what I'm trying to do now is speak to people who might, that this is their day one of exploring what's going on with AA and why is this happening. Recognize that some of the issue out there is the difference between a worldview that says this is legitimate AA if you can trace student to teacher back to Crowley, period. That's all you need. Okay. There's another way of looking at it, which is this is legitimate AA because it has a continuity of administration that we can trace back to Crowley, meaning human officers in certain officer roles that then transition to other human officers in those roles across time. And then there's another way of looking at AA, which is it's all ineffable anyway. It's all just about contacting the sources, and human lineage to Crowley doesn't matter and administration doesn't matter. It's just, if you're plugged into the source, then you have a right to claim yourself as AA. So that's some of that stuff is the source of confusion and is also the stuff that makes it easier for people to be perpetually at war with each other because they can always say that the other group is wrong because they're using a different definition.
Where do you fall on that on that spectrum?
I think there is, well, the most important thing is that someone can succeed and do fantastic work inside or outside a group, calling itself AA. There are great people in all sorts of different claimant groups doing great work, and I'm happy for them. And the most important thing for me is that if a student finds themselves a spiritual home in one of these, and that's what helps them attain, that's the whole point, So I couldn't be less concerned with
Okay,
whether they knock on our door here or not, for that. If it's working, it's working.
that's great. Do you feel that it's possible to fully work the AA and attain in the AA system outside of an order, just with the published material?
I think attainment happens outside orders in all kinds of contexts. So um, certainly that's the case with someone who might decide to work in an AA type way, in a self-initiatory type way. That doesn't mean they get all the benefits potentially of having a living tradition of teacher student transmission. That's a certain kind of benefit, but that's not necessary for everyone, evidently. So I wouldn't say it's necessary to join any organization to have attainment, except for some people it may be.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's really case by case.
Yeah, I like that view. That's a view that allows for everyone to be right.
Yeah, I mean, and that seems true to me. So it's convenient that it helps everyone be right.
Absolutely. So we're almost at the end here, but I want to. I'm just curious I'm curious to touch on the very end of your book where you talk about your own experiences with the HGA, and if you'd be willing to talk about that on the podcast, that would be amazing. But if it's too personal, that's fine too.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk more about that.
Okay.
It's what kind of a take on that would you like to hear?
What was I'd like to hear I would like to hear the story so that people can imagine.
Just the story itself.
Yeah, just
Yeah,
the
sure.
story. Yeah.
Yeah, well, basically, I'd been in the work for 11 years at the time. This was 2004. I had worked through the AA grades and other systems up to the point of being at that place in the system where you're theoretically ready to approach the final working of knowledge conversation. So moving through the Dominus Liminis and Adeptus Minor without stages of AA. So in the midst of doing this, my father was dying of cancer. My marriage was coming to an end, whether I knew it consciously at the time or not. My teacher, Phyllis, died in May of 2004. And so all of these things were falling away, and this is one of the personal, emotional touchstones that allows me to write things like I did in the introduction, where I say, when all this shit's falling apart, what's left? I lived that for myself in this period of time. And I realized that I was feeling overwhelmed, lost, confused. And for me, that was the final impetus I needed that said, okay, now is the time. You've got to do this. You got to do this working now, and so I started planning and executing that shortly thereafter for the rest of 2004, culminating in December of that year with the sort of the climax of the KNC working. And the way I was thinking about it, approaching that was sort of on the psychological level, was sort of like, I don't know what the fuck is going on. I don't have answers to what my life is going to look like, but the guy on the other side of this attainment, he'll know, so let's get there. So in other words, hopefully clarity is going to increase. And so what happened is in the course of, and as a result of that working, is that I just started getting, especially throughout the final week of retirement leading up to the climactic working, and in the aftermath of that, I started getting all this material coming through. I call it downloads. You just feel like stuff that I couldn't possibly have, as I said earlier, couldn't possibly have thought of myself or organized myself or even tripped into myself at the ego level. And after that, I've said this a lot lately, but it seems to be useful, that everything anyone knows about me or my work has happened as a result of getting to that place. That just broke open who I am and allowed me to start putting that in the world and creating a world where there's space for that, and a world for myself, that is, where my life could be a vessel for that. And when you know enough about your true will and you start creating a life that honors it, sure enough, the wheels really turn, and doors open, and you're going with the current. And that certainly doesn't mean that everybody has this, their lives are not going to look the same simply because they've had a lot of conversation. I'm often cautioning people, like, the purpose of being an occultist is not to be a masterful occultist who starts an organization and writes books. I'm not labeling myself as any of those attributes, but especially the masterful one. But I think it's, we each find ourselves in a different way, and it breaks open in a different way, and we create a life that honors it in a different way. But that's the kind of the thumbnail of the whole KNC experience and what it's meant to me. And the fruits of the downloads, as I called them, have ended up being things that found a place in the organizations I administer, in terms of ritual and symbolic forms and things that, what is another kind of verification of how this wasn't something I thought of, in the conventional sense, is that people are now, in their own way, the students, encountering these materials and bringing insights to them that I would never have gotten by myself either. It's like things are being unlocked in a way that for me is kind of verification that there's something uh, numinous there that's really contactable by not just my deluded mind.
Wow. Wow. You've written also about, yeah, by the way, I just remembered, I think one of the things you wrote in Living Thelema, or maybe one of your other writings that I thought was very funny at the time was, and very true, is that a lot of people get into magic and their goal in magic is to be the best magician ever.
Yeah.
Which doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
Yeah.
Also written about your experience working with the Aethers, and I'm curious about
Yeah.
that and how that related to the experience you just described.
Yeah, that was later. Memory serves, that was basically 2007 to 2011 in terms of working the 30 Aethys of the Enochian system. So for those who may not be familiar, Crowley's writings in the book called The Vision and the Voice are a record of his experiences with those Aethys. So this was private work, but I was doing it over the course of those years and got more stuff. It was connected to the original KNC experience and the material that started to come through there. It was clearly kind of an elaboration and a next steps of inner initiation going on. And so of course I kept records of all that, and then eventually a few of my friends and students urged me to make a public presentation of that. So that turned into the book called The Winds of Wisdom, which has methodology, but is mostly just the visions themselves.
Yeah, well, this has been an amazing podcast. I feel like we somehow this felt like cramming about 10 hours worth of content into 2 hours. There was a lot of material covered. I realized we'd covered just a tremendous amount of technical info, and I felt like we'd been talking for 3 hours, and I looked at the clock and it was only 45 minutes in. So, but this was great. Thank you very much for sharing your time with this podcast. And where can people find out more about you and your latest book and your books in general?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you. It was a fascinating discussion and really enjoyed it. You can find the Living Thelema podcast in a couple places, anywhere you get podcasts, of course, but livingthelema.com has the archive on there. The Living Thelema YouTube channel has all of that. In terms of my teaching work, magically speaking, Temple of the Silver Star, again, a Thelemic Golden Dawn patterned order that I administer. It can be found at totss.org. AA is at onestarinsight.org. And I am a psychologist, as we've said, and I do therapy and life coaching and things like that. And so my professional website is dr-shoemaker.com. Finally, I guess while I'm dropping links, one of the biggest upcoming events on my horizon is Thelemicon, which is a Thelemic conference on magic and mysticism that is open to the public. You don't have to belong to any organization at all. This is our fourth one. It's here in Raleigh, North Carolina in person, but also it's a hybrid conference, so we'll be online at the same time. And that is October 4, 5, 6 this year.
How many people roll up to that?
Last time we did the hybrid one, it was about 75 in the room and about 100 online, I think.
Oh, that's
something
great.
Like that. Yeah. And that's thelemicon.org for website.
I'm looking at it right now. Cool. Cool. Well, thank you very much for being on the show, and hopefully we can talk again at a future point. Maybe when you put another book out, or not. I'd love that.
All right. Thank you very much.